Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on Telesur. In 2017, Mexico registered the most violent year in recent history, with a rise in homicides and conflict in areas that had seemed to be under control. At 10 years, the drug war looks to be farther than ever from reaching an end. Why is Mexico caught in this vicious cycle? And what could be done to get out of it? We have here in the studio with us today Peter Watt. Peter, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Peter is a professor in Hispanic Studies at the University of Sheffield in England and an expert on Mexican contemporary politics and particularly political violence. Peter, let's go straight to the issue here. You have written 2 books on Mexico's drug war, and what we're seeing now is a seemingly perpetual war. Why is that? What's going on here?
I think there's a discourse about the drug war, that the drug war has failed. It's this kind of mainstream discourse you hear in the United States, but you also hear it here in Mexico. Although
it looks like it failed.
Yeah, well, it's certainly failed, but it's failed for civil society. But I think it's actually, in terms of the people who are controlling the drug war and making the policy decisions, it's probably been quite a success in some respects. But the human consequences have been catastrophic here in Mexico and elsewhere in Latin America, in Bolivia, in Colombia, for example, and in Central America, of course. It's also been a disaster, a human catastrophe in the United States in terms of the number of people being incarcerated, especially African-American men in US jails. So, but it's been a huge success for the arms industry, the US arms industry, for the US military agencies and the CIA, for example, and they have used the drug war to kind of extend their arms and their sphere of influence into Latin America, into Mexico. It was the way it was used in Colombia and Bolivia as well, and Peru, and it's also ironically been quite a success for the drug cartels and the narco traffickers. So you've had this.
In what sense? Has it been successful for the cartels?
Well, the cartels capitalize on a climate of insecurity, instability, chaos, unemployment, poverty. All of those things are very favorable to organized crime or crime gangs, and so they use this the political and economic instability that you see with neoliberalism and the growth in the numbers of poor people and people in precarious employment and so on. That's a success from their point of view, because there's always a flexible labor force. There's always a labor force of desperate young men who are willing to take risks, who have nothing to lose, to join the cartels as foot soldiers. So they've profited massively from this, and they profit also from the importation of arms to places like Mexico.
So we have the US government and in the war industry, according to your research, has profited from the drug war now over a decade long here in Mexico, and also the cartels. And it's certainly evident, all experts, there's a general consensus that they're at least as strong as ever, even though there's been kind of modifications there. But why the Mexican government?
Well, the Mexican government, as I think a lot of people in Mexico realize, but I think maybe outside Mexico, at least in Western Europe and the United States, I'm not sure people are aware of this so much, but there isn't this mythical dividing line between organized crime and the state. At least there's a great deal of blurring, but I think it's fairly clear to see that there is the state and organized crime have almost become one and the same. And in
terms of the complicity between state agents,
in terms of the complicity, they have shared interests a lot of the time. They have shared interests in power and keeping social movements and civic organizations from creating democratic openings. So they have a shared interest in maintaining power over the rest of society. And I think that's a really important dynamic in the way things have developed in the last 11, 12 years in Mexico. So in the last 12 years, you've had this intensification of the drug war in Mexico, financed as well by the United States with things like the Merida Initiative. And yet the cartels, as you say, are more powerful than ever. There is one aspect that we should also not forget, which is that the international banking system is absolutely fundamental to the whole industry. And so if you're asking why is it that the cartels haven't suffered in the way that you would expect after years and years of drug war, is because the banks launder the money, and the banks and the bankers aren't being punished for laundering literally billions of dollars.
We've seen that there's actually been, while there's this focus on a militarized approach to the drug war, you don't hear very often about serious investigations and breaking up money laundering circuits and the financial part of it. What does your research show in terms of the either efforts or lack of efforts that are happening in that area, and how could that improve the situation in terms of combating drug cartels?
Yeah, see, there's a real problem in the way that the drug war is represented everywhere, actually. In the United States, in Mexico, in Colombia, it's always represented as kind of blue-collar crime, blue-collar thugs, people from marginal backgrounds. But in fact, if you start...
street dealers.
Street dealers who, become very powerful, but nonetheless, there's a class-based element to it, which is fine. But we should also look at the white-collar crime. Back in the 80s and 90s, there were some efforts to punish bankers for money laundering. In fact, people went to jail for it. But in the last few years, particularly since the economic crisis, 2007, 2008, where the banks, despite having caused this global financial crisis, and then they're bailed out by the US government, the British government. The banks become even more empowered by this, and their profits go up by about 15%, the international banks. So,
and then what does illicit money have to do with that scenario?
Well, so, there's been a number of banks which have been investigated, for example, by the US Senate, for example. HSBC was one of them. In 2012. Before that, you had Wachovia. There's just been the Dutch bank Rabo being fined for money laundering, or laundering money for Mexican drug cartels. I mean, if you look at the HSBC case, for example, HSBC, I think its assets are about $2.5, $2.6 trillion. So that's more than the GDP of, many countries, right? It's the largest European bank. So HSBC gets the largest fine as a result of the US Senate investigation in banking history. But the fine is peanuts for them. Nobody goes to jail. I think it was at $2.9 billion or something like that.
There are almost never criminal charges.
There are never criminal charges. And one of the reasons for that is that, it's enshrined in Anglo and American law that corporations are, in law, they're human beings, essentially. So you punish the corporation, but you don't actually punish the individuals who are committing the crimes. And so it gives large corporations a kind of scot-free pass to act in nefarious ways without ever risking going to jail themselves. Whenever anyone does go to jail, there's a kind of, it's usually some a scapegoat in kind of lower echelons. In the case of HSBC, the CEO, at the time of all the time HSBC was laundering millions, billions of dollars for Colombian cartels, for the Sinaloa cartel, involved in some very dodgy dealings in the Middle East.
Taking truckloads of cash over
Taking truckloads of cash, people depositing suitcases, a load of cash through,
that's not suspicious.
The deposit boxes. But you have, so what I'm saying is that you've got to look beyond, the Chapo Guzman narrative why not look at the British bankers, the New York bankers, who all have, and you've got this revolving door between the US government, the FBI, the CIA, MI6, and the British cabinet. So the CEO of HSBC actually left HSBC to go and work in the British government cabinet of David Cameron. He became the Minister for Trade, and in his cabinet, Lord Stephen Green. So it just gives you an idea of the kind of impunity. The leaders of HSBC, they said sorry when they were grilled by the US Senate, and that was enough. The British Chancellor of the Exchequer flew over to the United States to pressure the US government not to lead any prosecutions against the HSBC bankers at the time. And then the British financial authorities were very remiss in the way that they treated that one case. So the HSBC case is just one case. Mm-hmm. But that is the kind of thing that doesn't get talked about enough, because the people who are laundering those funds are laundering money for terrorists, right? And we should look at those organizations as terrorist organizations. They cause terror in Mexico. They kill thousands of people. So I think that the banking industry and the bankers who commit these illegal acts, supposedly illegal acts, should go to jail.
So does it look like they have a double standard in terms of who's prosecuted, who's not prosecuted, who's investigated and who's not investigated in the war on drugs? Absolutely,
because the war on drugs is about money. Drug cartels exist because of profits. So if you get them where it hurts, they're going to go out of business. But it's, there are some researchers who will argue that the banks actually seek dirty money. It's not like they're looking the other way. After the financial crash, so this is an argument like people like at the Tax Justice Network, like James Henry, make, that after the financial crash, there wasn't enough liquidity in the mainstream banks in the US and French and German and British banks. So they have to seek out dirty money in order to get enough liquidity back into the system. And that also helps explain, I suppose, why the authorities are very reluctant to go after them. And then you've got the fact that the people who are high up in the banking industry are members of the British and US elite.
Well, I want to go back to a previous point. I was intrigued in your work by this concept that you just mentioned of an alliance between the Mexican government and the drug cartels, not a formal alliance, but say a commonality of interests, is I think how you put it, in terms of them against the population. And you actually talk about a war on civil society with the war on drugs. Explain that to us a little bit.
Yeah, so, what you're seeing now, and I think in many senses it's existed for a very long time. So if you go back in the 20th century to the 40s and 50s, you've got that alliance between traffickers and state authorities, like the DFS in Mexico, the secret police in Mexico, and drug traffickers. And it seems that the DFS was essentially running a lot of the narco industry. But of course it was much smaller then.
And tell us what the DFS was.
Sorry. So the DFS was the Dirección Federal de Seguridad, which was the Federal Security Directive, but essentially the Mexican equivalent of like the FBI or something like that. And in fact, the DFS is formed the same year as the FBI and the CIA, kind of on the suggestion of the US government. And of course, the Mexican Secret Service and the US Secret Service kind of they have a shared interest as well, and they're sharing information about subversives in Mexico, or what they deem to be subversives, and the US government is sharing information on, the Mexican government is sharing information on supposed subversives from the United States living in Mexico, people like Angela Davis and so on. But then I think your question was about the more recent years, where you've got this alliance between traffickers and the state. And so the militarization in the last 12 years has not reduced the violence. In fact, it's increased violence. And as soon as the government sends the military to the streets in what becomes in some areas kind of like almost like a colonial occupation in some areas of Mexico, because suddenly you've got thousands of troops involved in police activities, military forces. And I think what you see in Mexico is increasingly there's a great deal of discontent, a great deal of disillusionment on the part of the population. The neoliberal project has functioned in a way that has not benefited the majority of the population. Quite the contrary, it's benefited a small minority of people who have done very well and got very rich. And of course, there's with neoliberalism, there's a new billionaire class that arises, but you have swathes of poor people becoming more and more poor and more desperate. And in Mexico, it's kind of interesting because there's a tradition of social organizing and civic organization and anti-authoritarianism, which I think goes way back in Mexican history, at least to the Mexican Revolution. And so the response is often to form these very impressive and very vibrant social movements. And I think those tend to really scare the institutions of power, the institutions of government. And so you could look at the drug war and the militarization as a way of obviating or circumventing the possibility of some kind of mass revolt. And if many of the movements in Mexico do come together, a lot of the movements have kind of been isolated and fragmented. But were they to become a cohesive force, that could become quite a challenge for the Mexican government. So I think part of the militarization strategy is to spread a climate of fear. People are scared of the military, and the presence of the military in everyday life, in rural areas, in towns, it has that effect of keeping people afraid. So it's a kind of militarization of social control. It's not just happening in Mexico, of course, it's happening all over the place. So I think we have to kind of consider it in that light as well.
Is this part of what you call the totalization of the war on drugs, the way it, in a sense, permeates many other aspects of society than what people would ordinarily think of as just combating drug cartels?
Yes. So I think the other aspect of it is protecting investor rights. So, there has been since the 80s and 90s an acceleration of foreign investment in Mexico, extraction of natural resources by multinational companies. And the North American Free Trade Agreement was really about that. It was assuring investor rights in Mexico for large, Canadian mining companies and all kinds of extraction companies, and quite often, forcibly removing people from land and so on. So the militarization strategy has the effect of also protecting those very important financial interests. International investors invest in Mexico because they know it's going to be they're going to have a return on their investments, and that's what the government of Carlos Salinas and afterwards, that's what they have all guaranteed to the international investors. You will have a safe investment climate if you invest in Mexico, meaning there will be no strikes, you'll have a flexible labour force, you don't have to worry about health and safety legislation or environmental legislation in the way that you might do if you were doing business in California, for example. So I think the militarization has a kind of twofold strategy, but I think in a way the militarization ticks all the boxes for the rulers of Mexico and the United States and the corporations.
Militarization as a form of social control, that's what you're saying here. Have there been examples of this so far where you see this process being carried out here in Mexico?
You see it every time there is any kind of social movement in response to extraction. So it's been happening in Chiapas with mining, for example, and the mining companies, fracking, for example. Every time there's a civil society response, it's met with, or is very often met with military force and police repression. So this economy in Mexico, which we're seeing, which is largely an export-based economy, and that's what the free trade agreement is essentially about, has the effect of impoverishing Mexico, and these things are very unpopular, and it has to be done by force. You can't do it via democratic means because it's so unpopular.
One of the other periods in Mexico history that you've studied a lot is the Dirty War, in the 70s particularly, where there was another period where there was militarization, and in this case explicitly to quell social movements. Do you see any parallels or any lessons from that period of time in Mexican history?
I think there are a number of parallels. So, I mean, the Dirty War of the 60s and 70s, which took place in states like Guerrero, but also in the cities as well, in Guadalajara, in Mexico City. It was a very shocking period, and the level of state violence and state terror, I don't think has really been investigated enough. And so there's some historians who are going back and kind of reassessing this a period because they think that it was actually even more violent than was initially thought. But yes, so that and the Dirty War of the 70s is kind of treated in isolation. But my feeling is that the Dirty War from the 70s and 60s has just continued up to the present, and
that it didn't end. I
don't think it ended, really. Yeah. I think it's that sort of violence has always been used as a form of social control. It was Mexico, I think in the late 60s, maybe about 1967 at least, we know that the Mexican armed forces were taking people up in the vuelos de la muerte, the flights of death, putting people in aeroplanes and chucking them into the ocean. Even before Pinochet started doing that in Chile, and the Argentine junta started doing that in the 70s and early 80s. So I think this is a continuation, and the current administrations are drawing on decades of experience of counterinsurgency, where they view many parts of the population as an enemy in the way that an occupying army would view a foreign enemy. But in recent years this has accelerated. So since 2006, the recorded number of forced disappearances in Mexico is about 30,000. So those are recorded ones. So that's clearly a conservative estimate. But that's so in 1 year there's probably about as many disappeared people in Mexico as there were during the entire dictatorship of Pinochet in Chile. In the last decade, there's been an equivalent amount of forced disappearances in Mexico as there were in Argentina during the neo-fascist military dictatorship. So
people rarely think of it on that scale.
And I think we have to think of it in that terms, in those terms. It's different because Mexico is seen to be a democracy internationally, whereas in Chile, in Argentina, in Brazil, in Uruguay, the Southern Cone dictatorships, they became discredited because of the heavy-handedness of the state, openly heavy-handed. But Mexico, or the Mexican regime, manages to maintain this facade of legitimacy, and of course it helps that Mexico is a major ally of
the United States,
of Western European countries like France and the UK, and they, people in those governments have no interest in hearing about the 200,000 people who have been killed in the last 10 years of the drug war.
Well, unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our time, but I wanted to ask you before we do reach the end, I'm sure a lot of people would be interested in how you chose Mexico as your life's work, and the network of Mexican researchers. What's the motivation there in Europe in particular?
I think for me it was, one day I was speaking to some Mexican friends, and this was when I was going to do a PhD, and one Mexican friend said, "Why didn't you do something on the Mexican Dirty War?" And I didn't know anything about it. And that seemed like an interesting thing to look into because I knew nothing about it. So that's how I got into it. It was just, but then since then, the kind of teaching I do at the university is, I think in Western Europe, and the United States to Latin America is kind of the forgotten continent. The way that history is taught and the way that also the media shape the mainstream media, not telesur, the mainstream media shape our perception of the world is Latin America is forgotten about, it's somehow not important. And
you get very little news.
You get very little news, and when you do, it's kind of sensationalized. So it's, you know, Chapo Guzman is, you know, he's really, really bad, but there's no kind of context given to it. Or it's, you know, look at this chaotic thing happening in Latin America.
Some kind of a disaster.
And it's kind of treated with a kind of, you know, it's with, you know, as if it's kind of amusing. Look at these Latin people, they can't kind of organize themselves, they don't know how to look after themselves. So there's a kind of
racist.
Yeah, and it is racist.
Yeah.
So, so one of the reasons I like teaching this stuff is to go beyond that and to question that narrative as it is.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also
break through a lot of those stereotypes.
Break through those stereotypes, but also to understand that, you know, if you want to understand the contemporary world, it makes sense to look at the, you know, the colonization of America up to the present, because that really is the development of the modern world and the development of capitalism. And if we want to understand how we got to this moment in history, well, then we have to look back. And I think students and young people respond very well to that, because our education systems are set up in a way that breed conformity and consensus, and people don't question those dominant narratives, which are very Eurocentric.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop you there, because now we have gotten to the end of our time. Dr. Peter Watt, thank you for joining us here on Interviews from Mexico.
Thanks.
And thank you. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.